Reading these essays is like opening a time capsule to the 60s. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Read the Right Thing Book Reviews. I'm Eric. Thanks for tuning in. It's July 5th, so I hope you had a happy 4th of July. We're also in the middle of summer, and the baseball season is about halfway through. But today I'm doing a review of the great baseball writer Roger Angell, who sadly just passed away a few months ago. I'll be honest, I hadn't read him before. I hadn't even necessarily heard of him. At least I don't think I've heard of him. I read about his death in the New York Times, and he sounded like a really interesting guy and an interesting writer. So I went and picked up a book of his essays on baseball. If you didn't read about Roger Angell's passing, Roger Angell was an American essayist, and he was most well known for writing about baseball. But he also provided works of fiction, poems, and essays starting from 1944 all the way to 2020. He had a long, incredible career at the New Yorker. He's called the poet laureate of baseball, but according to his Wikipedia page, he didn't really like that title. I'm a fan of baseball. I grew up playing. I was okay in the infield and outfield, but honestly, I couldn't hit, so I stopped playing in about 6th, 7th grade, I think. But recently, I've taken a more liking to pro baseball, but I never really grew up with a team. So about 3 or 4 years ago, I decided to let a wheel decide which team I would follow and cheer for. So every year, I just go online and search MLB random wheel generator, and then I spin it, and whoever it lands on, that's who I follow, and I usually buy their hat. And this year, it's the Toronto Blue Jays. Now, this book, The Summer Game, is Roger Angell's first collection of essays on baseball. The book reports on a decade of baseball in the 60s, starting with essays on box scores and spring training before moving on to World Series recaps from each year. Capping off the book is probably the best essay in the book, and it's on why baseball and sports not just survive, but thrive in America. His joy of baseball is evident and contagious from page 1. The first essay chronicles spring training in the Grapefruit League in Florida. The essays contain vivid and poetic descriptions of the game, the stands, the players, and the fans. Reading these essays is like opening a time capsule to the 60s. But his writing, sort of like the sport of baseball, is also timeless. Take away a few things like cell phones and electronic scoreboards, and the game is essentially the same way it was in the 60s. Honestly, reading about sports at a very young age is how I fell in love with reading. I didn't always enjoy the books that teachers chose for us or books that you would see in your library, but I always loved going to the sports section. There's no shortage of sports content to devour, especially these days. There's magazines, newspapers, books, and now, of course, the internet has everything you could want. Of course, there's a lot of mediocre sports writing out there, but there are some great sports writers out there who aren't just great at sports, they're just great at writing, period. Growing up, I read a lot of sports biographies. Slam magazine was a really big one for me. I would read every page in their magazine, and I woke up every morning and went to slamonline.com and read up on the news. In junior high and high school, I really started to love long-form essays on sports. Bill Simmons was someone I enjoyed reading, and even players started to write blogs, like the NBA's Gilbert Arenas. Was Gilbert Arenas a writer like Cormac McCarthy? Of course not. But his writing style was funny, insightful, and entertaining, and his voice was completely his own. His blogs were usually hilarious and offered a perspective that had never been seen before. I loved Gilbert's blogs, and I always looked forward to reading them. And every once in a while, I'll go back and read them, and I still think they're real funny. People like Ethan Strauss and Zach Lowe are some current sports writers that I like to follow. Sports makes for great drama and really out-of-this-world characters. And if a writer can capture that, it makes for great reading. In my opinion, to be a great sports writer really requires a fresh and unique perspective. Like I said, there's a lot of mediocre and bad sports writing out there. We all have eyeballs, and we can see what happens in the game. As a sports writer, you shouldn't tell us what we just saw with our own eyeballs. I don't need a recap of what I just watched. Give us something new, fresh, exciting, and smart. A good sports writer will allow a fan to see the game from an entirely new perspective, or provide some information on the game or the players that only a close insider can attain. Angell's perspective is fresh from page 1. For example, comparing a box score to a spring flower conveys his love of the game in an entertaining and thoughtful way. I saw a video of Roger Ebert the other day, and he was talking about writing movie reviews. It was interesting because he said, even if you dislike the movie, You have to write about the movie in a way to convey to a person that they might be the type of person that would enjoy that movie. So even though he didn't like it, he wants to convey to the reader that, hey, maybe you would like it. He said you have to give the movie its day in court. He said you also have to understand that not everyone who reads the review is going to see the movie, but they still need to find the review entertaining whether they see the movie or not. And I think sports writing is the same way. A good essay on sports will relate to someone who closely watched every pitch, or the person who maybe just wants to read about what happened in the game without even being an invested fan. I think Angell's essays can be worth reading even to the casual fan or the non-fan. Instead of focusing on the essays about a particular game or season, I think the non-fan would enjoy the essays about the broader sport of baseball. It might even turn someone who's not a fan into one, or allow them to see the appeal of sports and baseball. Angell was from New York, so I think New Yorkers specifically would enjoy his essays. There are great essays on the 60s Mets and Mets fans, and also some essays on the Yankees. Roger Angell is most well known for his use of metaphors to describe the game and the players. Instead of saying something like the Dodgers are in a slump, he would compare a Dodgers team in a slump to a woolly mammoth stuck in ice. And when the team would turn around and start hitting, he would write how the woolly mammoth would shake and break shards of ice off its back. Or instead of saying something that anyone could say, like, he's a good hitter, he would say, he was a batter who looks at pitches with the eye of a jeweler appraiser. There were these metaphors that he would use that you would say, oh yeah, I can picture that. I can picture how that batter is standing, or I can picture how that fielder fields pop flies. My favorite essay was when Angell decided to watch the World Series from sports bars instead of in person like he usually did. He writes about how baseball is almost the perfect sport to see live, and how television just didn't do it justice, although he did enjoy being around the bar crowd. And I think anyone who has seen a game in person would agree. Even the non-sports fan can have a pretty good time at an MLB game. Baseball often seems somewhat boring on TV, but it's a lot more exciting in person. And I don't know how to describe it other than you're just enjoying yourself at the ballpark, and I think there's more action than TV can convey. For example, here's a part from that essay. Those millions of us who saw the series on television were left with the emptiest balloon of all. There's a small paradox here, because these were pitchers' games, and the television camera, hovering over the home plate umpire's shoulder and peering down the back of the pitcher's neck, gives a far better view of each ball and strike than any spectator can get from the stands. But baseball is not just pitching. A low-scoring series of games is stirring only if one can sense the almost unbearable pressure it puts on base running and defense, and this cannot be conveyed even by highly skilled cameramen. This World Series was lost by a handful of Yankee mistakes, most of which were either not visible or not really understandable to television watchers. The cameras were on the hitter when Maris fell in the second game, the grounder that bounced off Richardson in the third game, and Pepitone's astonishing fluff in the final game caused everyone near me to ask, what happened? On the same two-dimensional screen, it looked as if the throw to Pepitone had hit the dirt, instead of skidding off his wrist as it did. It is the lack of the third dimension on TV that makes baseball seem less than half the game it is, that actually deprives it of its essential beauty, clarity, and excitement. This book was an enjoyable read, but I did have some dislikes. The essays on the World Series seemed kind of repetitive. It was fun to read each recap, but they did start to get repetitive, and since I didn't know all of the players anyway, I found myself losing interest. And my least favorite essay was probably the essay written on the newly built Houston Stadium, which at the time was huge and state-of-the-art. I just found myself not really caring, probably because every city has a stadium like that these days. But I had to think back to the 60s and to a time before Twitter and the internet. You know, these days we see stadiums as they're built, and we get crystal clear pictures of every nook and cranny of the stadium. But before, the fans, if they were lucky, probably got a blurry image in the newspaper. And they wouldn't even get to see the stadium unless they were lucky to live close in Houston and go to a game. So that type of person would probably be interested in Angell's obsessive descriptions of everything from the turf to the scoreboard to the VIP lounges. So I appreciated that essay for what it was, but I didn't particularly enjoy it. If you're a fan of baseball, I think Roger Angell is definitely worth a read. And especially if you're an older fan, probably for the nostalgia factor alone, it's worth picking up. Maybe you don't have to read a book of essays all the way through like I did. It can get kind of repetitive, and younger people probably won't know all of the players he writes about. But on a rainy afternoon or a summer evening, any of his essays would be enjoyed. If anything, read his essay called The Interior Stadium. That was probably the best essay in the book. which is an essay on why baseball and sports in America are so popular. So I'd say, was this book the right thing for me? Yes and no. I enjoyed a lot of it, but most of the essays I probably could have skipped and just read the ones that I really enjoyed. Angell was revered by other sports writers, and some people have said there will probably never be another sports writer quite with his perspective. After all, he saw players from Babe Ruth to Bryce Harper today, and not many people can say that. So thanks for tuning in. That was my review of The Summer Game by Roger Angell. I hope you enjoyed it. If you enjoyed it, please hit that thumbs up and subscribe button, and let me know who some of your favorite sports writers are in the comments. As always, thanks for tuning in, and always read the right thing.